In this module, we're going to be tackling a problem which, for many of you, you'll probably ask, why bother wasting a week looking at something as simple as the meaning of value, or what we're going to formally refer to as the definition of value. And so this problem of value looks like it's not a question at all, but what we're going to find is the closer we look at it, the bigger a problem it becomes. In fact, it puts the valuer straddling two completely different approaches or understandings of what value means. At the very least, what we do know is that there are different factors that influence what a valuation is going to be attempting. Obviously, the purpose of the valuation, and the major ones which step outside of normal valuation are things like compensation valuation and insurance valuation. But also valuation for taxation or investment purposes all puts a different emphasis on what the valuer is aiming to do or what the client wants. Also, the nature of the client or the client organisation has an influence on the purpose of valuation, mainly through the purpose of valuation, but it does put a different emphasis on what the valuer is aiming to do. And so knowing your organisation is very important. Some larger organisations might have a very high volume of valuations that they want done, but they only really want them done in a fairly superficial level. A third aspect is the type of property. And we've already seen that. And so you're aware that income-producing properties are going to be looked at quite differently to owner-occupied residential properties and so on. Rural properties are dealt with differently, and there are other specialised properties we're going to be dealing with in advanced valuation. Also, the definition of value may be imposed by outside factors, such as legal statutes or other requirements. Perhaps you're dealing with a foreign investor who is working within some corporate environment which is really quite alien. And so these things you need to be aware of. It's one of the reasons why we're relying more and more on standards set internationally. To understand the starting point for the problem of value, Whipple explores the way that, at least at first sight, there appear to be a large number of values attached to the same piece of property. And Tom Whipple goes through the way that a seller has an ideal price, which is usually what they would really like to be given for the property, perhaps by Santa Claus or something, and usually it's a long way above the real market level. Conversely, buyers looking in the marketplace are often surprised that, oh, I didn't know real estate was this expensive. And so their ideal price is to come away with a bargain. Both parties are really wanting to get the better of the market, and often they're relatively fixed in those expectations. The buyer, while they might have their ideal price, even their tolerated price means that they're not going to come along to a real estate agent, suddenly discover that, well, here's my dream home, it's going to cost more than I thought it was, therefore I'll pay the money. No, at least at first, they'll be looking around from property to property, thinking, I don't want to spend this much money, but I want this quality of housing. And so the buyer's tolerated price, what they will be bidding up to, while it might be better than the buyer's ideal price, and so they might be grumbling a little bit, they're still looking for a bargain, and they're willing to maybe spend weeks or months trolling around the countryside looking for that bargain property. On the other side, the seller is not going to be taking the first offer. While they have their ideal price, below that price is maybe a price that they would tolerate, still a bit above the market. They're not necessarily in a hurry to take it, because they would like to find some fool out there who's willing to pay a lot more than market value and bring them home with a story they can tell their mates down at the pub or something about how they got a wonderful price for their property. The problem, as Whipple frames it up, and by the way, he sort of quotes other property economists who have looked at this problem and come up with the same stalemate, if you like, is that if this is the starting position, you really have this no man's land between what the seller is, at least apparently initially, willing to tolerate as the lowest price, and the buyer's tolerance of what they're willing to bid as a higher price. And somehow, if any selling is going to happen, any transaction is going to happen, you're going to have to negotiate somewhere in between. And so here we have really 4 values to begin with no middle ground. That would mean, if that was really all that there was, that there would be no real estate being sold. The reality is that that negotiating space is where the action starts to happen. And depending on the motivation of the seller and the buyer, both parties will be willing, to varying degrees, to move away from their expected tolerated positions of hoping to get the better of the market, come down to reality somewhere, and argy-bargy, and eventually there'll be a sale price worked out. Now, Whipple makes an interesting observation about this. He says that the distance, the discount that the seller is willing to give below their initial lowest possible price is in some way related to their motivation. So if you've got a really motivated seller, he believes the world's going to end, or he's got a job in Alaska or something and needs to move out next week, he doesn't really care what he gets as long as he sells the thing quickly. He's going to be willing to sell at a considerably lower price than maybe what he started with. And this would probably be the case with a seller who's had the property on the market for 6 months or what have you, and is just plain getting sick of living out of a caravan or something while they're waiting for the money to get into their next property. And so seller motivation can cause the seller to lower their tolerance level. Likewise, buyer's motivation does the opposite. It means that after a time, a bit of experience, or maybe a bit of need, or what have you, the buyer thinks to himself, well, I'm not going to be able to get it for the price which I previously thought was going to be the maximum I was going to be willing to spend. I will have to put in a little bit of hurt here, spend a bit more, go along to the bank, whatever. And so this question of motivation. The curious thing about motivation is that motivation, normally when you think about someone being motivated, you think about them being sort of keen and enlivened, maybe a bit of adrenaline flowing. We're motivated. However, when it comes to economic transactions, market transactions, what we're really seeing here is something that's really quite the opposite. Whereas psychological motivation we'd normally think of as something which makes you stronger, here the motivation actually makes you weaker. Remember the seller who needed to move to Alaska. He's in a weak position to negotiate, and so he has to give away a lot more. Likewise, the buyer whose wife might be expecting a baby or what have you, and they really wanted to move into the house by Christmas. Suddenly they're willing to pay more. They're weaker. And so they pay more not as a result of strength or information, but as a matter of weakness. We explore that in the study guide. To a certain extent, that's one of the points we're going to be coming back to. Now, amongst all of this, Tom Whipple notes that there are 2 forms of valuation, 2 fundamental approaches. And to a certain extent, what we've been looking at in this example of these buyers and sellers not talking to each other very much is the positive environment. Now, positive here is used, the word positive is being used in a particular technical sense. Positive here is meaning to put, or what is put, what just happens to be there. So we talk about a positive fact, we mean a fact which just happens to be true. You happen to be studying at CQU at present. You could be studying at Monash or Griffith or who knows what other university. It just happens that on this particular occasion, doing this particular course, a fact is you are studying at CQU. That's a positive fact. That's different to an essential fact, like 2 + 2 = 4, or I think therefore I am. Now, what we're talking about, why we're introducing this strange philosophical term? Because Whipple notes that there are 2 basic approaches to valuation. One approach is what he calls positive valuation approaches, and so they're based simply on the facts as they lie. And what that means is that the valuer's job is simply to take the positive evidence, which is the sales record, the comparable sales really, the evidence which is in the market, the physical tangible evidence, and without actually using any theory of value, any economic theory, and remember the last couple of weeks we've been looking at the problems of getting an economic theory to give us a value anyway. You simply take the fact that people have been paying such and such in the market for properties like this, therefore our property is going to be worth X. easy. What we'll be finding is that just about all of our working definitions of value that happen to get onto our valuation reports are just about always positive definitions, and we'll be looking at this a little bit further as we go along. So positive value is one which is based on the random facts of the market. The valuer does not employ any theory. Okay, they might be doing a bit of an adjustment grid here and there, but really the only theory is this property is like that property, therefore it'll sell for such and such, a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on the comparison. There's not really very much theory to it. So in that view, the valuer is a market forecaster based on the market. The market may not be getting the right price. The market might be dreadfully pessimistic, and the price might be a real bargain basement price, or it might be in the middle of a property boom, and right now we're paying so much for a property that if you try using it as an investment property, you're going to go broke. Right? Euphoria, that sort of thing. The alternative to that is what's called a normative valuation. Normative comes from the idea of normal, what is healthy, the healthy price, the right price, the true price. And the normative valuations attempt not so much to see what happens to be paid for properties like this in the market at this moment in time. A normative valuation is one which is finding what the real value of the property is. If I'm looking at buying an investment property, whether it's an office or a house or an industrial unit or something, I want to use my property to support an investment strategy. If I pay too much for the property, I'm going to go broke because my investment strategy won't work. I might have borrowed money at a particular rate of interest and the rent is going to be only so-and-so, and I kind of work out that I'm actually going to go bankrupt by having that investment. What that says is that if I pay a particular price for the property, I'm going to go broke. That's not going to meet my investment objectives, therefore it's the wrong price. What we're talking about here is things like the income approaches. The income approaches, and in fact some of the other approaches that we've looked at, are normative approaches because they don't necessarily tell you what the market is paying. They're rather telling you what the market should pay, what the true value is, according to some cost or income expectation. We go through that in the notes in a bit more detail. The difference here is that the valuer is not telling the client what the property is likely to sell for if it's sent to market in the near future, necessarily. The valuer is telling the client what the property is worth in terms of some intrinsic thing in the property, its investment potential, what its rent's going to be able to support within the commercial financial environment, of the time. Or perhaps, using the cost approach, the stuff which is actually in the property. So the normative valuer may be, by accident, giving you a hint as to what the property is going to sell for if it goes to market in the near future, but only because the people who might be bidding for that property, and in fact the sellers as well, all have an idea of the investment value. And so it's a kind of an indirect connection to the market when we're using normative values. Now it just so happens that when we're thinking about selling income producing properties, just about everyone uses the normative approach of the income approach, and so the market tends to be moderated by an expectation of normative investment performance, and that's what your cap rate is. And so in that case, the market price is going to equal the investment value, the true value, assuming the investment value is worked out prudently. Unfortunately, you find that even using normative methods, you still tend to make mistakes from time to time. For instance, if we're applying a capitalisation approach, and you understand how that works now, what happens if we're in an overheated market and people are paying too much to buy properties? The rents tend not to follow as quickly as the prices. That means that the cap rates go down. The cap rate being low means that you start off with a rent, which is as much as people can tolerate paying for your investment property. You're dividing it by a smaller number, which is the same as multiplying it by a larger number, and so the capital value is higher. That's all very fine, and so I'm using the income approach, which is a normative approach. However, the cap rate is calibrated to the market, not necessarily calibrated to what is a sober, sustainable investment. And so the normative methods, when we look closely at them, tend to have positive elements to them. And so they're not purely normative. Likewise, if we look closely at the positive valuations, we find that there are assumptions in them that are to a certain extent normative. And when you go through the study guide and when you read the IVSC definition of value, you'll see that the definition of value, while it's intended to be positive, has to do with creating a imaginary situation of a willing seller or willing and not over-motivated buyers and sellers, fully informed and that sort of thing. And so we're not talking about any buyer and seller, we're talking about these notional ones, these ideal ones, these normative market situation with these particularly motivated or level of motivation sort of balanced and so on. And so we find there's a lot of crossover and all the rest of it, and it tends to be not as clear-cut as it appears. However, these two ideas of positive valuation versus normative valuation are extremely important concepts. And so spend some time and look at that, because this is a question which comes up from time to time, and valuers can often face court litigation on the basis of the community expecting a normative valuation when the valuer has provided a positive valuation. So the valuer has said, yes, this property is going to sell for such and such if it's marketed in the next 3 months. Client reads that and thinks, oh, that means that this property is going to be worth such and such if I buy it in a few months' time, which I intend to use as an investment. And they might buy that in an overheated market. A year or two down the track, the property cycle might go bust, and the property is worth just about nothing, and the client's sitting there, or the owner in this case is sitting there with a big loan, and they go bankrupt, and they think, well, why did the valuer let me buy this thing at such an inflated price, because now my property is only worth half of what I bought it for, or maybe 80% of what I bought it for. Okay, so you've got that kind of a problem, that practical problem. So this normative positive valuation is important. What I want to do now is go a little bit further with looking at what these things are telling us. The problem with normative valuations is that they are accurate in supplying an idea of what the property should be worth, but they're not very precise in terms of telling you what they'll trade for in the market in the near future. Understanding the difference between accuracy and precision is very useful, not just for this topic, but for other topics related to valuation and property economics in general. And that's what this diagram is intending to demonstrate. The left-hand target has been shot at with an accurate firearm, maybe a rifle, but not a very precise one. And so you'll see there are bullet holes all over the target. And if you kind of do some sort of an average, the average point from those shots would probably be pretty close to the target. So you'd be a bit risky standing in the bullseye in that target, because between going to the left or the right, or a bit up and a bit down, if you shoot often enough, you're going to end up hitting the bullseye, or fairly close to it. On the other hand, the precise firearm which is used in the right-hand target, you'll notice it comes in with a really nice tight little group of bullet holes. That's fantastic. It might be a very high-quality firearm with a telescopic sight or something. However, you'll notice that that nice precise set of bullet holes all miss the target. Maybe someone's kicked the telescopic sight or something and it's kind of got a bit of a dent in it. Whatever it is, in that situation, even though you've got this fine piece of machinery that shoots a precise group, someone could stand in the bullseye, get shot at all day, and be quite safe. Because in that situation, while you have consistency of result, the result is consistently wrong. Now, this is often what happens with the positive approaches, because you might have consistent repeatable, good quality, comparable sales. They're all coming from a overheated market. They give you a nice, believable answer, which you supply to your client. However, is it the real value of the property or not? Well, it is the market value, because that's what the property will probably sell for if sold soon enough, preferably before the property crash. However, it's not really the true value. And this difference between trying to estimate the true value versus trying to estimate what people are likely to pay is this big question. Is value something which is in the thing, in the property? It's going to be perennial. People are going to eventually find that it makes sense. Or is it simply the market artifact, the social behaviour? Is it simply the price which someone or a group of people are silly enough to pay? That's the big problem. Now, if we think of value as simply the result of motivation, and remember we saw motivation as being this kind of issue of weakness on the part of either the buyer, the seller, or both, and we recognise that every transaction that makes up that set of comparables you're going to be using in your valuation comes as a result ultimately of one buyer negotiating with one seller to the point where they agree on a price, and you get a series of those events happening. Each one of those events is an event which deals ultimately with the behaviour of people. When we look at the tendency of people to behave in this way or that, we're talking about psychology. And so understanding or interpreting property value in terms of positive behaviour can be understood in terms of social psychology, or at least the methods of social psychology. And in the study guide we go into that in a fair bit of depth, just to look at the kind of potentials. It turns out that in economics a fair bit of probably the best research, and certainly in the area of forecasting, some of the best work is being done not using traditional economic curves and the sort of thing that you read about or study in economics, but in work which is coming from the discipline of social psychology in areas known as, for instance, behavioural economics and those related areas, okay, gaming theory and so on. All has to do with looking at economics actually as a form of psychology. And we see that to a certain extent when we talk about the market. People talk about the market being optimistic or pessimistic. People are optimistic and pessimistic, not markets. We talk about the motivation. Again, these are psychological terms. And understanding the psychology of the market, and you've probably heard that expression before, is very useful for the valuer to really develop. And you want to keep a closeness to an understanding of how the market is feeling, how the people in the market are feeling, and just how it's going to affect. Now, that means that you need to be thinking about things or taking into account of things, human emotions, fear, greed, envy, vanity, ignorance, clan or herd behaviour, right? And really kind of working back from, you know, those kind of things which can motivate people, and again, usually by weakening their resolve to stick by their guns and go for the bargain. Curious thing about what we've been looking at is that the positive approach is nice because you don't have to think about really the people that much. In particular, you don't have to think about them as having any obligation to each other. And so if I go in to sell my property, I want to get a better price than the market. In fact, I saw a real estate agent not very far from where I live advertising that he'll sell my property for me for more than it's worth. Now, in a sense, if someone was advertising, we will help you rob banks, people would say, well, there's a bit of an ethical problem there. But on the other hand, we have no problems at all with the idea of selling something for more than it's worth, which in a sense kind of rings certain bells of, hey, this might be actually stealing from somebody to get more than something's worth. However, when it comes to buying and selling in our culture, we tend to adopt the view of caveat emptor, which is a lovely Latin expression which means let the buyer beware. And so I'm going to try and cheat you if I can, and that's the way we do business. There's nothing unethical about cheating you in the market, which if you can say that and keep a straight face, you're doing well. Now, this question of whether there's ethics in value, oddly enough, doesn't get very far away from this positive versus normative question. Because if there is a normal value, then that becomes the true value, which in a sense, reasonable people should adopt for two reasons. One, because it's reasonable from a scientific point of view, we've worked it out, that's what it is. And the second one is, if I'm going to treat you reasonably, then I'm not going to necessarily want to charge you, no, I probably shouldn't charge you at all, more for something than what it's worth. That's a rather unfriendly thing to do. If I was to go into a shop and the fellow behind the counter was going to sit there and smile at me and say, well, here's a bottle of milk, and I'm going to charge you more for this than what it's worth, I would probably walk out of that shop. Somehow I don't feel uncomfortable, or somehow I don't feel comfortable about that. I would think that it's probably not a very ethical shopkeeper. And so ethics is kind of in there. Curiously enough, in the textbook, Whipple goes to a lot of trouble to show the way that the traditions in property economics is to keep away from the idea, the possibility that real estate price does have an ethical dimension. And so you can look at that to a certain extent, depending on if you're on the buyer side or the seller side more often. Again, that might influence whether you want to see ethics in or out of the real estate world. We're going to be dealing with ethics in a separate class, separate module, so I'm not going to go too far into it at this stage. You can read the notes on this slide, and especially the arguments that are put up in the study guide. As I say, we're going to be coming back to that later on. However, for our purposes now, what we can see is that there might be an ethical dimension to it. If there is, it will have to do with normative values. However, we live in an environment where valuation ultimately is defined as a positive definition. Positive definition comes from the Spencer case, which by now you should be familiar with, and I'm inviting you to perhaps read those judgments, the Spencer case judgments, if you haven't already, because they're really important for you to read at some point in your education. I'm putting it down as an extension reading. It's a positive definition. You'll find that the ideas in the Spencer case are very similar to the construction of the definition of value, which is adopted by the international IVSC definition of value. And so we rely on a positive definition which avoids all of the ethical implications and so on. And it ultimately still leaves us with some of these problems, because then the valuer still hasn't escaped this conundrum of whether they are simply estimating the market in the future, even though that market might be giving us a number which the client may think is the true value of the property, whereas the valuer is simply forecasting a number as a psychological process, whereas in fact that's different to the number which would come as an investment appraisal of the property.